When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. I am so thankful to have a fellow podcaster joining me for this special episode. We were recently introduced. Both of our podcasts are on the Evergreen Podcast Network, and it's been great to get introduced with him. And we actually had a great conversation, and we finally decided we need to go ahead and hit record on this because we've got some great stuff that we're going into here. So I want to take the moment to welcome Peter Zablocki, who is the host of the History Shorts podcast. Peter, thank you so much for being here.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
And Peter, like we were talking about, before we dive into talking about presidential history, because of course, with presidencies, we are talking about all things presidential history. Peter, I want to give you a moment to ask you about how you got into podcasting and what led you to launch your current podcast, The History Shorts.
So I guess my background is in education and history. I have a master's degree in history and an undergraduate degree in history. I've taught at a high school level for about 18 years before shifting full-time into college level education, where I now teach at Coldwell University in the state of New Jersey, where I teach primarily history. But the whole idea behind podcasting is really started during COVID. So my best friend and I, who at the time was also a history teacher, since then he's now a principal, I am now a professor, but at the time, it seemed like a good idea. We started a podcast called History Teachers Talking. And the premise was really just to kind of get in touch with our students, that we kind of missed our students on an everyday basis. And we wanted to talk about history, and we thought it would be something fun for them. But then apparently their parents started listening and other people started listening. And before we know it, we got signed by Evergreen, and there's thousands of people listening. And it was a lot of pressure, but it was a lot of fun. And then after that, that kind of still continued. But I'm also a writer. So, I've been published by numerous different publications. I have an article coming out in the Smithsonian in August, Smithsonian Magazine. I just signed a contract for another article for the Smithsonian. So again, I'm a writer. I'm a college professor. So the History Shorts podcast kind of came about because I find so many intriguing and interesting stories as I do research for various articles, whether there be books, articles, or so on and so forth. And a lot of these things I find, I'm like, oh, this is really cool. So I would write it down. And I'm like, all right, I'll come back to this. As you probably know yourself, when you do research, you're like, this is cool. I'll come back to this.
Oh, yes.
So, after a while, the I'll come back to this list becomes really long. And you're like, oh man, I'm never going to come back to this. But it's so, as a historian and just loving history like yourself, I want to share these ideas and these stories. So that's kind of how History Shorts came to be. It was this idea of, there's so many fun things that I just don't have the time to turn into an article, right, for a magazine, or I don't have time to even turn it into an article for a Substack that I have, or to write a book on, because that takes years. And some things some things go that route. And others, I'm like, this is just fun. I want to share it with the world. And I have two younger sons. One is somewhat interested in history, and the other one could care less. So, my wife is also in corporate, so I'm always like, "Hey, sweetie, did you know that?" And she's like, "That's great. That's great. Like, what's for dinner?" And I'm like, "Okay." So History Shorts kind of became my outlet. It was this idea of there's so much fun stuff out there. And initially I started once a week, and now I'm every day. It's a daily podcast. It's never more than 10 minutes. And the idea is just coming out with fun things. It's like, do you know that Charlie Chaplin's body was once stolen, and they try to get money for it to get it back, and his wife's like, forget it, I'm not paying you. There's like so many fun things out there that I come across. This idea of Hideki Tojo trying to shoot himself and then failing before being captured, and the Americans basically saving his life just so they could execute him later. These are such interesting things, and history's crazy. Just talking about history and teaching history, as you know, I always say that if someone doesn't get offended somewhere down the line, we're probably not doing this right, because history is offensive. But they just keep on coming. I have a plethora of stuff for my episodes, and just every day I find something new, and I'm like, oh, this is cool. So it's almost, for my listeners, it's like they're following my crazy train of thought of, you could kind of tell, like, oh, he's on like old Hollywood now for a couple of days. Oh, now he's shifting to medieval England for a couple of days. It's definitely, you could definitely follow my trek and my research there.
Well, and I love that, it's one of those things with presidencies being more narrative, and now I've got the seat at the table and the vice presidency series. It's like I've got a certain order that I have to follow. And then I find guests to come on and I can go in a completely different direction. And it's like, okay, yes, finally, I can indulge in that. But I know and I've had other podcasters that I've talked to who just kind of go with the flow. And it's like, there's something that's kind of liberating about that. Just being able to follow your train of intellectual interest and curiosity.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And we were talking about it before we clicked record. You're set for, what did you say is the year where someone calculated? Like,
yeah, I had a listener that one time calculated, okay, based on your current rate of putting episodes out, you'll catch up to the current time of the presidency. I think it's like 2170 something. I was That's like, well, crazy. I guess sign me up for the cybernetic enhancements. I'll go ahead and be ready.
That's awesome though. Yeah. And what the beauty of it is, you're doing something you're passionate about, and it comes through when listening to your podcast. You're clearly passionate about these topics. And I think that's what that coming across, even though it's just through, microphone in a sense, but it comes across. And then you find other people that are passionate about the same things, and boom, you're touching, I guess you're, awakening some form of curiosity in people, which is cool.
Absolutely. I certainly hope so. And that gets us to kind of what we were talking about as we were thinking of how can we collaborate. And you actually recently started a series. You had mentioned your Substack. You recently started a series on your Substack where you are covering the post-presidencies of folks with whom listeners of this podcast are well acquainted with. Washington, John Adams, Jefferson, Madison, those founding presidents. And so, Peter, I wanted to start our conversation, as we dive into this idea of the post-presidency in the early republic. What inspired you to take up this topic? And are you just planning to cover the early presidents, or do you intend to go all the way up to the modern era?
Oh, man. Well, that's kind of like your thing, right? You're going right? So this started initially very much like my other history shorts episodes, and except it went a little further because I kept on researching more and more and more. But for me, I just started a series on history shorts that's only this summer and only on Saturdays and weekends. I called "Where Are They Now?" And I said to my wife, I'm like, honey, would it be cool to like continue this idea of like what happened to these historical figures after the textbook chapter ends? Like what happened to George Washington after, George Washington as you know them? Or what happened to the Wright brothers? And it's funny because my wife's like, they're dead, Peter. They're dead. And I was like, well, obviously I know they're dead, but this idea of like, where are they now? But that started off this idea of where are they now? I was like, okay, I'm going to incorporate this into history shorts somehow. And it really started off for me with Madison, which I think we're going to talk a lot today about because he surprised me the most. But then I'm looking at Madison. I'm like, well, if I'm doing Madison, what happened to the other presidents? And all of a sudden, I'm like, well, I can't just start with Madison. I'm not going to start with the fourth one. I might as well start with the first one. So then I paused Madison. I went back and I'm like, all right, what did Washington do? And I'm like, wow, that's a short time after his presidency. But it's also a very interesting time and very enlightening. And it really gets you going into thinking like, okay, what are these people doing after their time in history has passed? And it's fascinating. It really is. And I'm only on 4. I'm working on the 5th one now. So we are going to be getting to Monroe. Do I want to? I mean, ideally, I would get to all of them. But as you know, it takes time to research these things, and that's kind of the issue here. Is just finding time. But I did think that there was a lot more info here than just a History Shorts episode, because I easily could have turned this into like a weekend summer series too, of where are they now presidents. But I felt like there's a little bit more in this. So for me, it's like levels. All right, is this History Shorts research? Is this, an article research, or is this a book research? And this just fell that one extra step because I thought there was so much compelling stuff here, and it just kept on stretching the information.
Have you ever wondered why we call French fries, or why something is the greatest thing since sliced bread? There are answers to those questions. Everything Everywhere Daily is a podcast for curious people who want to learn more about the world around them. Every day, you'll learn something new about things you never knew you didn't know. Subjects include history, science, geography, mathematics, and culture. If you're a curious person and want to learn more about the world you live in, just subscribe to Everything Everywhere Daily wherever you cast your pod.
Absolutely. Well, and I'm sure for my podcast, typically with the narrative series, I start out with 2 episodes on the pre-presidency. Then we go through, the deep dive into the presidency, and then we finish up with a post-presidency episode. And for some, and, we'll talk more about this, Washington didn't have that long, and it was still a very impactful period. But then you've got folks like, I don't know that John Quincy Adams's post-presidency is going to fit into just one episode.
Oh yeah, no.
One's
just
a
his
long
death
one.
alone. I mean, John Quincy Adams falling in the middle of the floor, in the house. There's a lot there.
That one's going to be a big one, but it is fascinating, and especially this idea, in the early republic, and that's something that studying Washington, which also, by the way, kudos to you for not making Washington the very first one that you worked on. I feel bad for George Washington, because if you're talking about presidential history and you're starting from the beginning, you typically start with Washington. But I know with me, there's so much that I've learned since then. It's like, oh, I wish I could have done all that over again. That was my learning period, and everybody learns with George Washington.
Of course.
But
yes.
It also speaks to the nature of being the first president and the first post-president. There were no rules. There was nothing that said this is what you're supposed to do or this is what you have to do. And so he was kind of making it up as he went along. And likewise with the others, they went in different directions. And it is a fascinating thing. And so kind of going into that, and it sounds like we'll probably be talking about Madison here, but in terms of the post-presidencies and deaths that you examined thus far in the series, what was the most surprising thing that you learned about in the course of your research?
So, yeah, going back to Madison. So Madison, what really got me about Madison is that every time I learned about him, he always felt like I went back to like Austin Powers Mini-Me, when it comes to Jefferson, like he's always like the Jefferson shadow. And he follows Jefferson not just into office, but then he also follows Jefferson, University of Virginia. Like he's just continuously following Jefferson. He follows Jefferson back. They're basically neighbors, in Virginia. He's just always following Jefferson. And just as Jefferson's legacy has been reexamined and is viewed as flawed and is continuously analyzed and overanalyzed, specifically in current events and current times, it's almost like Madison was foreseeing that would be the issue, and he took it upon himself while he was still alive to try to fix it. And that to me was what really kind of grabbed my attention is, Madison was this, short guy. They say he was like 5'2", right? And I just envisioned him sitting there just with an eraser trying to erase things. And it's like this little guy, no, we got to change this. But actually that's kind of what he was doing. And that was to me the most surprising, is that Madison, all of a sudden, in his retirement, realizes, and this really comes about when he is brought back to the Virginia state. They bring him back to help revisit the Virginia state constitution. And why wouldn't you, right? You have the guy that wrote the federal constitution living in your backyard. It's like, hey, can you help us with this one? He's like, sure, I'll help you. And he shows up and he's like ready to go. But while he's there thinking that he's going to be this revered the father of the federal constitution that he wrote, 30 years before, they're actually kind of attacking him a little bit. And they're like, you had all these tendencies in the Kentucky, Virginia resolutions where you wrote that with Jefferson. You were kind of talking about secession and you were okay with going against the government, and you were okay rather like going against, the status quo. And he was kind of like, wait, what? No, I wasn't, but they're like, it says right here, you were for that. And he's like, oh man. And then they started talking about this idea of slavery as well. And that's kind of when it came up on him that potentially he might have really come across as someone that was very pro-slavery, which he was, right? But now he's like, wait a second, like this, now I'm being kind of, they're pointing this out as if it's a bad thing. And from that point forward, when he returns from that state debate, he's like, all right, I got to change things up. And he goes as far as literally pulling all his papers. He is, at one point, I forgot which historian said it, but this idea that he takes letters that were written by Jefferson and he actually forges Jefferson's handwriting to kind of make himself seem better. His idea of like, I'm going to set the record straight. And, he's to the extent that he's continuously changing and tweaking and changing and tweaking. And even, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but even this idea of like his famous or infamous, I guess famous last words, it's like he's dying and he's still tinkering in his mind this idea of like, I mean, his last thing he says, and I might be getting ahead of myself a little bit, but he says something. And then you have Nellie, who I think is his niece, like gets really close to him. And she's like, Uncle James, what did you say? And he says, it's like nothing more than a change of mind, my dear. It's like, oh, he's still thinking. This guy's still trying to like figure things out. The last thing he's talking about, the last thing he utters is, just a change of mind, my dear. It's like this conniving little James Madison. No pun intended, because he was kind of short. But that's what got me. It got me because history, it's like this guy was ahead of his time because he realized he followed Jefferson all the time. And in the very last minute, he didn't follow Jefferson because Jefferson was like, I'm broke. I need to sell people. I need to sell things. Like, it's bad. And yet here's Madison that always followed in the footsteps, but he's like, wait a second, I can still fix this. I could prepare my legacy. And pretty much everyone that goes after him, all the presidencies. I mean, think of, you're looking at JFK, you're looking at Nixon. The reason that there's even recordings and tapes for Watergate is because these guys were trying to preserve history so they would remember what they would write about themselves, right? It's setting the history the way you want to be remembered. And Madison is like the pioneer here. He's like, all right, I'm late to the game, but I'll fix it. And that's kind of what got me about, that was the most surprising thing that really got me about this series.
Yeah. And that's the thing about Madison. And I think there's more work that's starting to be done around that, but it's still not, it doesn't seem to be quite as addressed as it probably should be, but he was very much this political mastermind. He was really thinking in terms of the long game and with his legacy as well. And the fact that he pretty much won out because for so long, the story that he crafted was what people thought of James Madison. And then also the enemies like Robert Smith, people like that their stories were told from the perspective that Madison wanted them told. And then you start to dig and you're like, okay, this isn't adding up. Oh, okay. Because we're basing all this on Madison's interpretation of this event, or Madison said this, and it's just, you get to realizing how manipulative and really strategic it is. And it's, in some ways, it's like, oh my gosh, this guy had this amazing mind to be able to really think all this through. And then it's like, oh, that's kind of dark.
Yeah, very dark. One of the last things he does is he's literally laying in bed dying. He decides he's going to summarize his relationship with Jefferson for posterity. So he calls someone in to dictate. He's literally dying. He's like, all right, let's set the record straight. So I wasn't always following Jefferson along. We were more like partners. He does this whole thing. And to sign it, he's barely signing it. They say it's, when you look at that signature, it doesn't look like his because he was dying. So he's just like, I could still sign this. I said this. Like last thing he's thinking about is still changing things. And at one point he wanted to go back and actually change some of the Federalist Papers. I mean, the thing that he's probably most known for, apart from the Constitution, but he's like, I could tweak this. And they're like, no, you're not. No, that's not going to happen.
It's out there now. We're not tweaking. Yeah. Well, and same thing. And it's interesting. I'm just thinking of this now. Dolly Madison kind of did something similar when they were, she had folks approaching her about telling her story and being able to talk about, and especially the story of the Washington portrait that was saved from the White House when the British were coming.
Yeah.
And she manipulated that story as well.
Oh, yeah.
She wanted to make sure that she came off as the heroine. She was the one who was directing things. And then you see other accounts and you're like, I'm not sure that she was.
I don't know, Dolly.
I'm not sure that you really saved it, but it's interesting. And this, and like you said, Peter, this is really the first time in presidential history, post-presidential history, that you see somebody really concerned about this kind of legacy. The others, either they didn't have time or they're like,
it is what it is.
It is what it is.
Yeah. And the thing about Dolly you mentioned too, is it gives me this idea when I thought of Dolly, because Dolly was very instrumental in continuing what Madison started with this rewriting of history.
Oh, yeah.
Like you said, this idea of her role in it, and specifically her role in it. But it gave me an idea of almost when I thought of Jackie Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy was instrumental in the creation of Camelot, and having, taught for decades. Even now, my college students are, JFK was the best president ever. I'm like, oh, that's cool. Why do you say that? Well, he wore Ray-Bans. I saw that picture, and you're like, so the myth is there, right? And and I always tell them, like, you gotta back this up. You gotta back everything up, you say. But I think a lot of that has to do with post JFK's assassination. It was Jackie's idea of, all right, we're going to have the horse drawn carriage, and we're going to have my son salute. We're going to, like, she came up with that, like, let's make him on par with Lincoln, really, his funeral. Let's make it that. And I think Dolly, good old Dolly is very similar now. She's like, all right, I'm going to continue this. And she did, for a while, hide things that Madison had done, only released certain papers because she was the holder of all these papers. She would release them based on which ones he had, already adjusted. Again, both these guys are more modern than not, which is, kind of cool when you think about it, because this is 1800s, early 1800s.
Well, and it's interesting that parallel between Dolly Madison and Jackie Kennedy, and I think for both of them, there was a sense of, not just trying to preserve their respective husbands' legacy, but also this economic necessity. They were trying to figure out, how am I going to live? And, Dolly, it got really bad. She got really desperate. And this was part of James Madison's legacy to her. He thought that these papers would keep her satisfied for life. It would bring in enough revenue for her to be able to live for the rest of her life. And it didn't. Part of that was paying Todd, but that's a whole nother story. But likewise, Jackie Kennedy, once Jack died, she wasn't really, she wasn't part of the Kennedy clan. She had to figure out how she was going to live. And part of this was creating this myth of Camelot and being able to craft that legacy and being the person who had control over that legacy and what it meant. She knew that would be what would keep her sustained, help with the kids, get them to where they needed to be. And it's really interesting. And I really love Paul Brandis's series on Jackie O. It highlights some of this. It was really fascinating to hear some of the details of what happened after the assassination in Jackie's life until she married Aristotle Onassis.
Yeah. Which was also considered by many as just another safety net, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
I can't wait for your episode on JFK. So let's figure this out.
Let's see. How many is that going to be? 100 years from now?
Yeah, that's a few decades. That's awesome.
Well, turning back to our founding presidents. So with these first four founding presidents, John Adams, of course, had the longest post-presidency at over 25 years, while Washington had the shortest, passing away just shy of 3 years after he left office. So, Peter, which post-presidency do you think was the most impactful, and which would you say provided a missed opportunity?
All right. I'm going to have to go with Washington as most impactful. When you teach Washington, you always teach about the precedents, right? The idea of that he set so many precedents. And the precedents he said, as you mentioned before, I'm not sure if it was when we were already recording or not, a lot of this stuff was he was just like, I don't know. No one came before me, and this is what I think, so this is what we're going to do. And then everyone that followed him is like, oh, well, that's what Washington did. So, I think the one thing that Washington does that is an awesome precedent, and therefore I think that it is impactful, is the idea of freeing slaves at some point, right? Because we know that, he technically says they'll be free, like all my slaves will be free after Martha dies, right? That's the whole idea. But then Martha's scared that someone's going to kill her. So then, so then Martha's like, okay, we're going to speed this process up.
Yep. Go ahead and go. It's fine.
Yeah,
it's fine.
Cool. Yeah, it's cool. But just the sheer fact that he didn't need to do that, and he does mention it, when he talks about it in his will, and he does say, look, some of these slaves are not mine to give away, right? And some of the slaves, belong to the plantation or my wife. And however, after she passes, so on and so forth. And until that moment, he is very specific about education. He goes, I want these slaves to be educated. This in itself, I think, sets a really good precedent for a lot of, and it's ahead of its time. I mean, let's face it, you're looking at the time period, these planters, for them, this was the norm. Having slaves was, enslaving people was the norm. So it wasn't necessarily like they were like, oh, I feel so guilty about this. Although Jefferson would write that he felt guilty, but then, actions sometimes speak louder than words.
Yeah.
So in this case, Washington was truthful to his thoughts. There was no dichotomy here. There was none of that Madison/Jefferson of, look, I'm such a good person. I really think this, but, being pragmatic. Yeah, no, Washington is truthful. He's like, I think this, and this is what I'm going to do. And I think that in itself is the most impactful thing about the retirement, and post-presidency of George Washington, is the fact that he never stops setting precedents. Yeah. It's almost like a gentleman in office and a gentleman out of office, which I thought was really, really cool. But he was also, the reason he died, again, there's a lot we could add to that, but Washington was very gracious. He was when someone showed up to talk to him, he took the time. And they say that's why he got sick, right? He's riding his horse, it's snowing, and because he was talk about, we have our morning routines. These guys were routine. Like, Washington was like, all right, I'm going to get up at this time. I'm going to read letters. And I'm like, it's like, it's time to stop reading letters. I'm going to have tea. So, and every time you read these accounts, I'm like, whoa, I wonder how specific these guys were. Cause then he read letters for 35 minutes and I'm like, okay, come on. But maybe, then he goes riding and he checks out in his plantation because it was left desolate. His lands were bad after he left again because he left twice, obviously, right? He left after being general. He's like, ooh, I'm chilling, we're retiring. And then boom, he becomes president. Then he comes back and he's got to get his land in order. And a lot of the money comes from the distillery at that point. He starts, obviously that's one of those fun facts about Washington. But he rides his horse and it's cold. He's wet and he comes back and all of a sudden Martha's like, oh, visitors are here already. And normally he would go upstairs and change and dry off. And he's like, no, it would be improper to make them wait. So, the George Washington sits down, his hair is wet, he's just shivering, and he's like, let me tell you the stories of war. And the next day, he's like, I can't get out of bed, I'm coughing, I'm sick, and, and then basically the modern medicine of that time did him in,
quote unquote medicine.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, let's bleed this guy. And I mean, they at one point didn't they like cut? I think they cut by his throat to help him breathe, right? I mean, they hurt him over and over again. No wonder. And he's just like, oh man, this is. And he kept on saying, even like the last few things, he's like, it's over. I'm going. Like one of some of his last words are rather like, I'm going. And then he like wakes up 2 hours later. No, 'tis well. It's all over now. And then he wakes up 2 hours later. He's like, no, I know this is happening. Like it's going.
It's really happening this time.
Yeah, this is really happening. Yeah. So, anyways, I think that made him really impactful. Opportunity missed. You know, I think opportunity, and I hate to stay with the same topic, but Thomas Jefferson, right? I mean, Thomas Jefferson, and also a little bit John Adams. Well, it's starting with Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson, as we know, one of the most divisive, complicated presidents, in the annals of American history, could have followed Washington. And specifically because Washington's views on slavery were not as known as those of Jefferson, nor Benjamin Franklin for that matter. I mean, Ben Franklin, his views are also known. He's against slavery. But Jefferson prided himself on that, in the Declaration of Independence. And you have this whole paragraph that's erased from it, right? Because he's talking about freeing slaves. And he keeps on returning to this topic of this idea of like, well, slavery's going to die off because it's evil. I know it is. And there's just so much dichotomy that almost by not freeing his slaves, and as opposed to selling them, and he broke up families at the end, right? Because he was so bankrupt. He would sell his own, children and break up full families. And it almost, I think, takes away credibility from a lot of his writings, from a lot of his legacy, because while Washington acted upon his views that he didn't even let people know that much about, this guy was all, I believe. And then in the end, it's like, but do you really? Right. Yeah. And that I thought it was the opportunity missed. I mean, he did a lot of, crazy things in his retirement besides going broke, obviously. And, debts, and he signed a note for somebody that put him in more debt, and he did wind up with, doesn't he like make a folding chair, a hemp machine, calculates the eclipse. I mean, he does a lot of cool things, except the important one, he drops the ball, and that's kind of my thing. And then going to Adams a little bit, I have like an interesting relationship with Adams because I kind of like Adams. He reminds me of like this grouchy, like a Danny DeVito. Like I just think of Danny DeVito when I think of John Adams. Like, right? Don't you feel like he's like this grouchy, angry little man? And even like his son is stopping by his house in a retirement. It's like, and he's like, all right, well, I hope you have fun doing this. Like, Dad, you should pose for this painting. Ugh, fine, if you want me to. Like it's just this grouchy old man. But a lot of people faulted him during his presidency for not doing enough. Right. Yeah. And then when you start really reading and studying the quasi-war with France and the building up of the Navy and him trying to avoid a war that we likely would not have won, you almost start to think, all right, maybe he was sacrificing himself in a sense for what he believed was the right thing for the nation, whether it was popular or not. Because everyone jumped on the Hamilton bandwagon and they were like, let's form a military. Congress is like, we're going to make an army and we're going to take Washington out of retirement. He's going to lead this army back to the glory days. And here's Adams, and he's like, armies are here to suppress your liberties. If you want to defend our shores, because we're fighting against the French or the British, they're over there. They have to come here first. So if we're going to spend money, we should spend money on a Navy, not an army. What are you going to do with an army? Like, and everyone's looking at him like, oh, he's anti-army, like he's anti-America. And here's this guy trying to rationalize with the politicians of the time. He's like, guys, like, no, I'm trying to prevent a war and the XYZ affair, and him continuously sending, it almost has that Jimmy Carter vibe to it. Oh, yeah. When Jimmy Carter, when we're talking about the hostages, Iran hostages in the late 70s, early 80s, and really it was Jimmy Carter that got them released, not Ronald Reagan, right? They were released at the time Ronald Reagan was being sworn in, but everyone knows this. It's an open secret that it was Jimmy Carter, even after he was a lame duck president, he's no longer, he was not reelected. He is still fighting behind closed doors to try to make this happen. Mm-hmm. And I think that to an extent, Adams has that same vibe. Like, I'm going to do this behind closed doors. Like, I can't admit that have pirates stopping ships, French ships. We can't admit that, but I'm doing it. I'm okay with that, but I'm not going to admit it. So he's getting destroyed in the press. And then, Alien Sedition Acts, which Congress technically passes. I mean, not the president. I always remind my students this idea that like legislation is not passed by presidents. They sign it, but again, that kind of hurts him because he signs that.
And one of the things that I always try and point out to folks, again, this is still early on in the presidency. There's not really a precedent for how the veto power works.
Yes.
And so you look at the vetoes that Washington did, and they were typically because he felt that they were unconstitutional.
Yeah.
That it was against the Constitution or it was against federal law. And so he was like, this is wrong. This has to be vetoed. And technically, John Adams looked at the Alien Sedition Acts and he's like, well, I can't really see that there's anything in the Constitution that says that we can't do this. So, but now we've got this idea of the veto as if you think legislation is bad or you don't want it to pass, you can veto it. But that wasn't necessarily the case in those days.
Yeah. And I feel like he was too grouchy and angry to set the record straight, and that's what I thought was a missed opportunity because he lived the longest out of all these guys, right? I mean, he was like 90 for that time. That was ancient. Back then you would die at 60. So he has the time. He also had a platform. His son was the president of the United States. I mean, he really could have tried to set the record straight, and he didn't. He was like, I don't care, whatever. I'm just going to be angry about this, and I don't need to set the record straight. And that's what I thought was a missed opportunity. He could have tried to preserve, not go to the extent of Madison as in rewriting history, but maybe highlighting certain aspects of history, or his history. Instead, he chose to retreat to his books. I mean, he was an avid reader. And they said that looking through his library, it's like he's having conversations with his books, which I thought was so cool.
Oh, yeah.
He would just write in the margins and write, and he would like argue with the book. No, that's not right. And it's like, no one's going to see this. I mean, obviously we see it now, but for him, he was just doing his thing. He was having conversations with philosophers that had died 200 years before. He didn't care. He was just doing his thing. And it's really also cool. The one opportunity that he did seize was the ability to reconcile with his really good friend, Thomas Jefferson, which I think it's definitely narrative-wise, it's a really cool story, and It's like a nice button at the end. Like, click, like they did it. Yay, they're friends again. They never saw each other again, but at least they started seeing eye to eye. It just shows that, especially in today's world, it shows that apart from politics, like these are still men. We're still human. We could still, put all that other stuff aside and just talk like human beings. And I think that, that's a good lesson for now, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And you look at the Adams Jefferson correspondence, and there's this one line that from John Adams that, we have the opportunity to explain ourselves to one another.
Yes.
And that was the big focus for Adams. It wasn't, and you see in his writings after the presidency, he knew he was coming after Washington. He knew that was not an ideal place to be in terms of being remembered in history, because you're coming after the great American Cincinnatus, His Excellency, George Washington. And here he is, little John Adams.
Yeah.
And he struggled with that in his presidency. I'm reading Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky's latest book that's coming out. She's going to be a guest on the podcast, and she's going through the Adams presidency. And that's one of the things that she focuses in on is how Adams struggled being in Washington's shadow. And even in his post-presidency, even in his legacy, he knew he was never going to be on the same par as George Washington.
And honestly, maybe not even second place.
Yeah,
right? I mean,
probably not even second place.
Hamilton would have probably gotten second place. Yeah.
Well, and he knew Jefferson was coming after him, so he's like, yeah, there's no way. But the fact that he was so concerned about rebuilding this, or at least thawing the relationship between him and Jefferson and having this opportunity to explain themselves to one another, that really speaks to John Adams and what his focus was. And it's so fascinating. But to your point, Peter, it also is a missed opportunity, because it takes a while before we can actually see these letters and see what Adams thought of things and really understand his legacy more. And it takes somebody like David McCullough coming up and publishing this widely popular book that people start to give John Adams a second look, and he gets a miniseries and all of this. But for so long, John Adams was relegated to just, being bookended by these two giants in the early republic.
Yeah, 100%. And even his own party didn't like him. Like I said, his party preferred Hamilton in the early stage. I mean, he had a rough go there. He definitely had a rough go. And I think that's what kind of draws me to him, because, you always want to go for the underdog here. And it's like, it wasn't, like you said, from the very start, he was following in Washington's footsteps. It was not going to work for John Adams.
No. Well, and I'd like to go back to another point that you made earlier before we move on. This idea of Washington freeing the people that he enslaved in his will, making those arrangements. And you see with Jefferson, you have the Marquis de Lafayette who goes to him, and you have Edward Coles who goes to Madison, and they're making the same argument, and they're saying, and they're pointing to Washington. Hey, look, Washington did this. This is a good precedent to follow. This is what you need to do. And if you want to ensure your legacy, if you want to ensure that you're seen as being one of the greats, this is what you need to do. And they didn't. And, Jefferson, of course, his financial disaster, but also the laws of Virginia were changed and it became more difficult. It wasn't impossible, but it was still more difficult. But still, the fact that they didn't really even try, and none of the rest of them do. Washington, part of the reason Washington stands out is that he was the only one of the slaveholding presidents who made those arrangements in his will.
Yeah. There's also a little known story with Jefferson the two known Poles during World War II, so Pulaski and Kosciuszko. Kosciuszko and Lafayette were friends, and Jefferson were friends. So all three of them were really good friends during the Revolutionary War. And Kosciuszko actually designs the plans for West Point that are eventually stolen by Benedict Arnold. He was stealing Kosciuszko's plans, blueprints. But so Kosciuszko, as an engineer, to get paid in return, because he winds up returning to Poland and trying to start his own revolution, very much on par with the American Revolution. He fails. But needless to say, before he goes to Poland, he is rewarded for his contributions to the American cause with a lot of land, right? And this land is granted him, and he decides that since he's not going to be in the U.S., he's going back to Europe to try to start an independence movement. He makes Jefferson the executor of his will.
Mm-hmm.
And in the will, it states that if or when Kosciuszko passes away, his land holdings in Virginia are to be sold, and money from those land holdings are to be used to free slaves, to buy slaves' freedom. Any slave, really, because obviously Kosciuszko wasn't here to have slaves. That's what the will stipulated. And sure enough, this happens. Kosciuszko passes away, and it falls on Jefferson to execute this will, and he refuses. He actually passes it on. He does not want to do it. He's not going to sell these lands, use the money to free slaves. This would look bad for him in a sense with regards to his own slaves. And he kind of needs the money too, but at the end of the day, it wasn't his money. So what he does is he actually passes the will over to Virginia. He gives it to the state Congress legislation, and he says, you guys it's yours, figure it out. And then Virginia takes the land and they divvy it up, sell it up, and no slaves are ever free from it. But Jefferson had a chance there. He had a shot.
Yeah.
Another shot. It's like, how many times you're going to give this guy, hey, okay, try one more time. Like, you're sure you don't see it this way? Come on, one more time, and go with what you're saying. Like, he's got friends telling him this. He's got this other opportunity. This wouldn't have cost him anything, but no, which again, takes away credibility from all his other writings and supposed beliefs.
Yeah. And it makes him a frustrating figure to study in history because it's it's like, how do you reconcile all this? And it also speaks to the complexity of the human experience that,
Yeah.
Contradictions can exist in any of us. We
100%.
we live in contradictions, but it's just so frustrating because you're like, you just want him to do.
Yeah, and
more.
he did a lot of great things. We shouldn't make this let's just hate on Jefferson thing. It's just talking about missed opportunities in that perspective, because Jefferson, he still does a lot of great things. He's, as a president, he's one of the first founding fathers. Declaration of Independence. There's so much there to be proud of. But he, I think we should probably sum it up by saying he was definitely a product of his time. And while someone like Washington might have transcended the time, that's what makes him so much more special, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Jefferson didn't, and that's the difference. They were both great men. All four of these guys were great men. They were human, they were flawed, and some transcended the times for good or for bad, like Washington probably ahead of his time for good reasons, Madison ahead of his time for bad reasons. Let's change and tweak this history, but at the end of the day, like you said, they're just human beings, and the bad comes with the good, and that's kind of where we are,
Yeah.
So,
absolutely. Well, and it's interesting because and we do have some instances where these founding presidents, they didn't necessarily retire completely out of the public spotlight after leaving the presidency. George Washington, even though he didn't really kind of go out in the field, he was named as a general during the Quasi-War. They did have some public points, Jefferson founding the University of Virginia, being so instrumental in that. They didn't go completely out of the public spotlight, but I think we could safely argue that there is more of an expectation for former presidents to be more in the public spotlight in the modern era than in the early republic. And so, Peter, I was wanting to see what similarities and differences do you see in the post-presidencies of the first 5 presidents versus those of the modern day?
Yeah, I think the fact that you have every single person, and I can't say every single person, but likely most of the people you come across have a recording device right in their pocket.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing escapes anyone now or anything. And you take an image, I remember when President Obama was running for president, it was a picture of him walking out of on the beach, and it's like, future president has a 6-pack, and it's like, whoa. And then, the next day you have Putin riding like a horse, shirtless.
Oh, gosh.
And you're just like, oh God. But, these guys are much more today, much more aware that everything they do is recorded.
Mm-hmm.
Their presidency, once in the spotlight, always in the spotlight. Here is John Adams. He retires. He goes back to Massachusetts to his books. He's just chilling. He's like, I don't. People stop by his house, and he's like, fine, I'll talk to you. But these guys don't have a choice. And now, I think that they are. It's almost like, will we ever know the true person of any of the more modern presidents? Because the act never stops; it goes on. And they all want to have their own library afterwards, and they all want to collect their information on how they will be remembered. It's all about this legacy. And again, Madison was ahead of his time in that sense, but it was easier for Madison because there was not a lot out there. For these guys now, there is an expectation for them to remain how they are remembered. It's like, you're not allowed to be human. You're like this pantheon of American history. Like, once you're president, you're president. And therefore, we're going to hold you to the same standard. And therefore, I don't think we really know these real people because, I assume President Obama picks his nose sometimes. I assume that, right? I mean, these are like normal, but they're aware that someone out there could almost catch them when they're most vulnerable, and God forbid, because the media is going to jump on that. So, yeah, definitely a lot more pressure to adhere to a standard that has been preset for them or set for them by themselves. And the older guys didn't have to do that. They're, again, there's the idea of a president was so new through these first 5 presidents. The world had kings, right? I mean, these guys are like, I'm just a public servant. What do I know? Except Madison. It's definitely except Madison. There, yeah.
Well, and it's interesting, and that was one of the things with Lindsay Sherinsky's new book coming out. She has this one point, and I'm probably going to ask her a question about this, where John and Abigail are heading back to Quincy, and they end up like all the inns are full. And so they're having to just kind of sleep in their carriage or, whatever accommodations they can find. And you're like, this is the president and the first lady. That would never happen nowadays.
Never.
They would force some other people out and give them the best
100%.
room.
Yes. And if they did, they wouldn't, the hotel owner would. We got the president.
Exactly.
What? Like, this could make it on Twitter. Like, this could be on X. Get out.
Oh, yes. Please, let's take a picture. You're at our location, our hotel or whatever. Yeah.
100%. But I feel like this started this really started, I would say, probably with Andrew Jackson really is the first like populist president, right? I mean, that's when these guys start, when you think of the mudslinging campaign of 1824 to 1828, like that's when it becomes less about what these guys have to offer versus who are these people, right? It becomes about the person. And after that, they never turn back. It's always about the person. So because it's not about really their policies and more so about the person, once you stop being president, guess what? You're still the person. So you need to keep that going. It's like, I was elected partially because of the persona. So the persona has to stay. Right. I know people for the longest time that are like, well, I'm going to vote Republican because I'm a Republican. I'm going to vote Democrat because I'm a Democrat. It's like, well, what do you think about these views? Well, I don't care. That's what I'm registered at. I registered like that 40 years ago. It's like, okay. It's kind of similar in this sense. It's like, well, which one of these guys do I like better? I'm a Republican, so I'm going to find a way to like this guy. Or I'm a Democrat, so I want to find a way to like this guy, and you're just playing a part. It's insane. The world we live in is insane.
We are cursed to live in interesting times.
Indeed.
Well, and Peter, as we're kind of wrapping up our conversation, I thought that it would be good to kind of end with this idea of those last words, of the four, because, that's what people want to hear, what were their last words? But I think you make the point, and we can discuss this a little more, that this was also wrapped up in this idea of legacy. You were talking about James Madison trying to come up with this great, pithy quote. And I was wondering, of the four that you covered thus far, which former president do you feel had the best last words? And with the caveat you mentioned in the post, you mentioned John Adams. Sometimes posterity helps to make their last words sound better than they really were. But which ones did you really enjoy?
I think the most expected one was actually the real John Adams last. Those one was expected because in the very end, he's, here's a guy that's been president, vice president, founding father, right? Such a truly pantheon of American history. And yet he is this old man who's blind by now, basically. He's laying in bed, and his last words are not asking about Jefferson. Last words are, he turns to his granddaughter. So now you have these generational things, just a grandpa with his granddaughter. And just the fact that his granddaughter's sitting there like, how can I help you, grandpa? Like, this is just so, it humanizes him. And his last words are, help me, right? Like, help me, child. Like he asks for help. And I think that kind of grounds him and not humiliates him, puts him makes him more humane, makes him human versus, this legend. However, does he say, oh yeah, Thomas Jefferson lives? Yes, he does say that, right? But those are not his last words.
Yeah.
Some of his last words, I guess you could put that little asterisk there, but it reads better, right? By saying that he asks for Jefferson, and how ironic they both die on the 4th of July. But I think that the humility of how he goes, sitting with his granddaughter and just simply asking for help, I think that was really touching to me. And then, go back to Madison, his idea of he's still thinking, still tinkering. Just a thought. And then boom, expires. It's like, I am still trying to figure out how I can fix this.
Yeah.
And that to me was also interesting because it kind of shows where they are. Like one, John Adams is I'm just a human being. I'm just a great grandpa. And Madison's like, all right, I still can do this. I can still do something. And then essentially when you ask, when you look at the views of what happened with Washington, I'm pretty sure he just says like, I'm going, right? I'm almost positive like that's some of the last sentences he says is he's paranoid that he's going to be buried alive, right? That's like the last conversation he has on his deathbed. He asks to make sure that he is not buried for 3 days to make sure he's truly dead. And he takes that really seriously. They said that's like his last movement. He like lifts his head off his pillow, right? And he like to like look at the person he was telling this to, and he's just like, make sure you do not bury me for 3 days. And they're like, all right, cool. And then he's like, all right, 'tis well. And then he just like puts his head back, and they say like, that's the last thing he said. It's like, 'tis well. And then he expires, he dies. But like the seriousness of it, it's like paranoid about death in a sense.
I want you to poke me with a stick for 12 hours total continuously.
So crazy. And then it's interesting because as soon as his last words are "'tis well," and then he dies, and then right there, Martha's standing right there, and then she repeats "'tis well," like all is over now. Because as we mentioned before, he was kind of telling these guys for a while, it's over now, and then he would just wake back up, like, oh, not yet. Still here. And also going back to Madison, I keep on going back to Madison. He was very close to also dying on the 4th of July. Which would have made a great narrative because Monroe had already passed by then, right? On 4th of July. Mm-hmm. Jefferson passed on 4th of July, and Adams passed on 4th of July. And even though Jefferson, for a second there, he might have not made it. They lied to him, because he kept on asking. That was Jefferson as he's like falling asleep. He's dying. He's like, is it the 4th yet? And they're like, no. He's like, okay. And then he would wake up. Is it the 4th yet? No. And finally he woke up at like 11 something at night. And he's like, is it the 4th yet? And his secretary is like, this guy's not going to make it. He's like, yes, it's the 4th. He's like, oh, okay, good. And then he does live through the 4th. He does live through the night. But Madison, they were like, the doctors flat out saying, like, we could give you medicine. We could try to hold you through. You could do this. It's late June. Like, we could make this work. He's like, no, stop giving me medications. Like, let me go. Yeah. It's almost like he wants to, and again, maybe I'm looking into this too much, but maybe he wants to separate himself from Jefferson for once. His whole life, it was just Jefferson, Madison. And I think this is the idea of he didn't want to go and be lumped in with the others. He wanted to go on his own terms. And again, do I know this? No. As historians, we infer a lot, but I think that would, that could or would make an interesting narrative.
Well, and also this idea of, all these folks dying on the 4th, and we know that they had drugs to keep them going for a little longer, and more than likely they were administered to one, if not all of them. But then there's also the speculation, did they give them drugs to go ahead and make sure that they died on the 4th?
Imagine. We
don't really know for certain, but it's more than likely this is too big of a coincidence to just be, all natural, the divine power, whatever, working here. But Madison, for whatever reason, breaks this. And I think probably all the other presidents after him are like, thank you, please.
Yes.
We don't all want to die
don't
on the 4th.
Don't kill me on the 4th of July.
Please, no. Let's just go ahead and end this one with three and done.
That is so funny. But and it's the whole process of writing these is definitely enlightening. And because when I write these, I've only written 4, almost done with the 5th, but I look at primary documents, I look at secondary documents, and I publish these on my Substack that, so I don't make money. It's just because I'm having fun with it. I'm so curious how all the other ones go. You know what I mean? Like you asked before whether I'm going to take this all the way in the end. I don't know, but I certainly am curious, the last moments of all of them. So it's just like, I got to get there, just for my own thing. But I don't know. Maybe I'll make this a series on a history shorts. Maybe somewhere down the line. But until then, just little by little, you'll probably see another one, next month. By the end of the summer, they should have another one. We should get to Monroe, and then we'll go from there.
Well, Peter, I look forward to reading about Monroe's post-presidency final days, and wherever you take this or however you go in your intellectual pursuits, we look forward to it. To our audience, I highly recommend checking out the History Shorts podcast as well as Peter's Substack. I'll have links to both on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. And Peter, as we're wrapping up, I just want to give you a chance. Where can folks find you on social media?
Yeah, so you could actually find History Shorts is on Facebook, just Facebook. I think it's like /History Shorts podcast. So History Shorts podcast on Facebook. You could find me personally, and I do a lot of cross thing with History Shorts on X, just PS Zablocki. That's kind of like my author page, but also I do a lot of History Shorts stuff in there as well. And you could just go to www.historyshortspodcast.com. So yeah, the main three that I really use. I am also History Shorts podcast on Instagram, but really Facebook is probably the one I use the most. I do like these fun facts every day. So every single day there's like some fun fact that I kind of post on there as well. Just to kind of keep it going, keep it fresh. But yeah, you could find me. Not a problem.
Absolutely. So everybody, as you finish up this episode, please go and check out History Shorts. Peter, thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you for all the work that you've done, not just researching these 4 post-presidencies, but just all the great body of work that you've produced thus far. And we look forward to seeing what's next for you.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, Jerry.
And for our audience, thank you for listening. We hope that you've enjoyed this. Take some time to dig into these post-presidencies. And until next time, stay safe and healthy. Be kind to one another. And take care, dear friends.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol, about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.